Chicos, nuevo vídeo de Bravo Research, vamos a ver qué nos cuenta.
They're going to drop another 15%, 20%. So much more to come on the dollar.
There's a lot of concerns that it could be a weaker dollar policy, something that structures an orderly decline of the dollar.
The dollar's decline long overdue. The euro and the yen are still almost 50% undervalued. The rubber band is snapping back.
Something has just broken on the US dollar. The US dollar index has witnessed its largest drop since COVID-19 and has completely disconnected from its underlying fundamentals. And this is something that could have massive implications for the economy and financial markets. Since the dawn of civilization, every currency that has come into existence has ended up dying out and disappearing into irrelevance. The people holding these currencies as they were dying out ended up seeing all of their wealth completely disappear. In the 1940s, for example, the British pound could be exchanged for $5. It was the dominant global currency at the time. By the 1980s, the British pound was only worth $1, completely destroying the purchasing power of anybody holding the British
Bueno,
pound.
esta primera parte del vídeo básicamente lo que dice es que a lo largo de la historia las divisas han pasado de tener mucho valor a tener poco valor, cambiando a otra divisa que cogía un poco ese poder.
And having massive repercussions on the global hierarchy, global trade, and geopolitics. Today, it's not the pound that's under attack, it's the US dollar that is the dominant global currency today. And many are projecting a similar fate to the one of the British pound, possibly catalyzed by Donald Trump's new government policies. Indeed, the US dollar index.
Aquí se plantean si el dólar con la caída que ha tenido, aunque creo que este vídeo no es del todo, no está del todo actualizado porque el dólar lo ha hecho bastante bien ahora con el acuerdo entre China y Estados Unidos y ha recuperado bastante terreno, pero sí que es cierto que, por ejemplo, contra el euro ha caído de 1,0204 a 1,10 que está ahora más o menos, ¿no?
Also known as the Dixie, which measures the US dollar's exchange rate against a basket of other major currencies, has been under significant selling pressure ever since Liberation Day on April 2nd, where Donald Trump announced his new tariff policies. Now, it's not been an outright collapse, but something has happened that is suggesting this decline in the US dollar could be a lot more dangerous than it looks. And that is that the index has disconnected from US government bond yields. This line basically shows us the return on investment that you get for owning US dollars. And this is the US dollar's strength against other major currencies. Throughout the last few years, both of these have been very
Está comparando aquí el retorno de los bonos americanos con el precio del dólar.
interconnected, and that makes sense. As the return on investment of the US dollar increases, the foreign exchange value of the US dollar should increase as well. This
Aquí si nos fijamos,
exchange value of the US dollar should increase.
Básicamente
The
aquí,
foreign
aquí.
very interconnected, and that makes sense. As the return on investment of the US dollar increases, the
¿vale? O sea, mientras el US dólar se incrementa, mejor dicho, ¿vale?
foreign exchange value of the US dollar should increase as
También, o sea, quiero decir, aquí lo que está explicando es que mientras el eurodólar, o sea, el eurodólar, mientras el bono paga mucho, el dólar debería tener fortaleza, ¿vale? ¿Por qué? Porque si fuera al contrario, que es un poco lo que está pasando, tú compras bonos que pagan muchísimo o pagan muy bien con una moneda que está devaluada y que está barata, con lo cual cobras aún más. Entonces, teóricamente, esto debería ir siempre a la par y no contrario, que es lo que estamos viendo a día de hoy.
well. This gap right here is telling us that the US dollar has been weakening despite the return on investment staying elevated. This could be signaling that
Es decir, en este caso, o bien el dólar se aprecia o bien los bonos deberían pagar menos.
something in the currency is currently breaking. It could mean that interest rates need to rise a lot more in order to stabilize the US dollar, or that if interest rates don't rise, that the US dollar could see a complete collapse. But before we can say this for sure, we need to understand exactly why this gap has been created. Firstly, tariffs are a form of tax, and from everything that we know about tariffs and taxes, we know that they slow down the economy. Foreign exchange rates are heavily influenced by local economic growth, and so if investors believe that tariffs will slow down growth in the US, it makes sense that the dollar will be weaker. Now, this could end up being quite a temporary
Bueno, aparentemente asume que aranceles iguala pérdida de valor del dólar.
concern because the US economy is generally in a strong shape and remains the undisputed leader in pretty much all key industries of the future, which will drive economic growth. The second reason, however, is more concerning. Donald Trump's tariff policies will reduce global trade volume. Most global trade is conducted in US dollar terms, and so naturally tariffs reduce demand for US dollars. If we're heading into a world where global trade is
Lo he
declining,
cogido un poco con pinzas, no es otra cosa que decir que la mayoría del comercio se hace en dólares y que si ahora va a haber menos comercio por culpa de los aranceles, pues entonces habrá menos demanda de dólares. Menos demanda de dólares implicaría una depreciación del dólar.
that could put the US dollar on a sustained path to continue weakening. But the final reason for this gap could be the nail in the coffin for the US dollar, and that is that the current administration is potentially deliberately seeking to weaken the US dollar as part of its broader economic strategy. Indeed, Donald Trump has talked about wanting to have a weaker dollar many times before. After all, he wants to make American industry great again. And a weak US dollar makes American-produced goods more competitive. That can boost US exports to the rest of the world and so stimulate the manufacturing sector in the United States. It could be that his policies will be specifically targeted towards keeping the US dollar weak, and that would be very similar to what happened with the
Aquí básicamente asumir que Trump quiere el dólar débil, creo que lo ha dicho varias veces, pues para poder exportar más bienes.
British pound in the 1940s. All of these currency devaluations of the British pound relative to the dollar that we talked about earlier were driven by two root causes. First of all, the British economy had a high trade deficit, meaning that the UK was not manufacturing locally, and that made the economy struggle. These devaluations of the British pound made British goods more competitive and stimulated the local economy. The second reason for these devaluations was the massive debt burden that the UK was facing after World War II. By devaluing the British pound, it became much easier to pay back the old debt that had been accumulated when the pound was a lot stronger. The UK government essentially chose to sacrifice the status of the British pound in order to resolve its domestic issues of high levels of government debt and high trade deficits. It's not completely crazy to compare the UK in the 1940s to the US today.
Bueno,
The
aquí dice que un poco la devaluación de la libra en el pasado se parece bastante a lo que podría ser la devaluación del dólar a día de hoy, ¿no?
US has been increasing the size of its trade deficit significantly over the last 30 years, meaning that less goods have been being produced locally, which has completely hollowed out an entire part of the economy, as we can see from this chart showing employment in the US manufacturing sector. At the same time, the US government has an absolutely massive debt burden, being one of the most indebted countries in the world, with the size of the government debt surpassing the total size of the US economy in the aftermath of the Great Financial Crisis and the pandemic, leading to an even more severe accumulation of debt. This means the US government is in a position where it really should be cutting its spending and raising taxes in order to get its budget under control. And both of these measures can be very painful. The alternative, less painful option is to devalue the currency, stimulating the local economy and making the debt easier to repay. Now, if you are holding US dollars and you're worried about the dollar weakening, there's a couple of things that you can do. And by the way, this is not financial advice. This is for educational purposes only. The first thing you can do is diversify your currency risk. Somebody that has a lot of
Alternativas para no tener riesgo de dólar si crees que esto va a ocurrir. Una es pues tener un portfolio en diferentes divisas.
cash on the sidelines doesn't necessarily need to keep it all denominated in US dollars. You can spread your risk out on multiple different currencies. One of the currencies that we like is the Swiss franc, for example. Now, the return on investment on the Swiss franc is very low, but the currency has an extremely strong track record of outperformance against the US dollar. The country is in a strong financial shape with one of the smallest debt burdens in Europe, and that generally is good news for holders of the currency. The second thing you can do is buy assets. A devaluation of the US dollar would mean the price of housing, stocks, gold, Bitcoin, oil would all have major tailwinds pushing them higher. You can check out a very recent video
Bueno, y la otra opción que te dice es que compres activos. Se le olvida decir que existe una opción también de fondos hedged, fondos cubiertos de divisa, de lo que ya os habla en el canal varias veces. Un vídeo más o menos, bueno, no me parece mal, pero creo que es un poco ir detrás del precio, porque el eurodólar o el dólar ya se ha depreciado sensiblemente, ¿no? Este último mes. Esto hubiera estado bien hace un mes, ¿no? Con el eurodólar en 1,02, 1,04. De todas formas, pues puede ser, no lo sabemos, a ver qué pasa. Si os ha gustado, me dejáis un like, un comentario, os suscribís y nos vemos en el siguiente vídeo. Se despide la Pizarra Andrés.